So for this lecture, I want to introduce two Greek terms that are really important for improving as a writer, actually for improving in anything. Those terms are telos and techne. Telos is a term that's often translated as end, goal, complete, perfect, while techne is translated as skill, art, or artistry. Now, in the modern West, we have a really problematic relationship with the word perfect. Part of the reason for this is the story of Jesus. Christianity, as transmitted through the Greek and Roman church fathers and through the Catholic and Protestant philosophers of the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment being the substance or foundation of all Western moral philosophy. So Jesus taught his disciples to be perfect, even as his Father in heaven is perfect. The problem with this idea is that the ideological framework within which Jesus spoke is not the ideological framework we work in today. To paraphrase Alasdair MacIntyre, we use the same words, but those words don't mean the same thing. So the word perfect, or telos, as Jesus used this term, must be understood within the context of the first century Hellenized Roman Empire. And within that context, they had this idea called virtue theory. In virtue theory, which goes all the way back to at least Aristotle, all human beings are constantly maturing towards some predetermined end, a telos or a goal, a reason for being. Achieving this telos, or rather becoming this telos, is the entire purpose of life. And once the telos is attained, you'll be perfect because you're finished, you're complete. Which is really what the word perfect means, finished or complete. Now notice two ways the term telos can be used. It can refer to the goal in itself, the telos or end you're reaching for, but it can also refer to the process of pursuing that goal. In other words, the word can mean someone has already reached completion, is already finished, but it can also carry a connotation that suggests one is moving in the proper direction, moving towards the goal. In other words, that one is in process of becoming what their telos or telos says that they should become. So when Jesus said to be perfect like God, he was referring to godliness or godlikeness as the goal. But he was also saying that his disciples needed to be heading towards that goal. He certainly couldn't have implied that his listeners should already be there. If they were, they didn't need to come to him to be taught how to get there. So hopefully you see where I'm heading here. As a student of anything, writing, reading, football, yoga, you are not perfect in any of the senses suggested by our modern use of this word. Because our modern use of this word has the connotation of flawless. But as a student, you shouldn't feel the need to be flawless. If you already had all the skills and knowledge necessary to have the life you wanted professionally or personally or philosophically or morally or whatever, you wouldn't need to come to school. You wouldn't need to go to church. You wouldn't need to get a degree. You wouldn't need to work to be better at whatever it is you're trying to do. So you're here in school specifically because you don't know everything. You don't know the specific things that you need to be complete, to become a complete professional. Okay? In the case of writing instruction, you're here to learn the skills necessary to produce perfect writings. But what does that mean? I mean, if once upon a time the word perfect meant finished or complete, what then does it mean to produce a perfect paper or a perfect essay or a perfect novel or whatever? Notice that the idea of something being finished or complete is an objective idea, even within an educational context, and even for someone who's not perfect in the sense of being morally perfect or done with their life or having reached their final professional goal, their teleological end, fulfilling the purpose of their life. Even within that context, finished or complete is an objective idea. But because at some point in the evolution of our language, perfect stopped meaning finished and started meaning flawless, We have some real problems with this word. And this is why. Whereas perfect is an objective thing, generally speaking, and a flaw is an objective thing, generally speaking, each of these terms can easily be subjectivized. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that something that's not a flaw can be made to look like it is a flaw because human beings are good with words and human beings are good at rationalizing things. We can see something as a flaw just by calling it a flaw, just by using the right words. In writing, this can be particularly problematic because writers subjectivize their work when they agonize too much over words and phrases, when they quibble unnecessarily over perceived flaws. When they do this, they never get done. They never finish a project. Now, there's nothing wrong with quibbling per se. There's nothing wrong with wanting something to be better. Quibbling can lead to a better product. But if the quibbling gets in the way of finishing a product, then it becomes a vice. Perfect can also be subjectivized, the term perfect. It can be subjectivized in a way that encourages you not to do your best work. It can be subjectivized in a way that feeds your laziness. If perfect means finish or done, then you can say something's finished when it could be better. You could say something's done just because you don't want to do it anymore. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you've put in your best effort. And people do this all the time, students especially. They wait until the last minute, put in minimal effort, which they will interpret as a great deal of effort because they worked on the thing for several hours under great duress as they saw it because of the looming deadline. And then they expect accolades for subpar work. The thing you've produced isn't perfect because you didn't give it your best shot. You gave it a half-hearted shot at the last minute. That doesn't lead to perfection. And so what you're turning in isn't a perfect product. But as a student, you shouldn't necessarily expect yourself to be producing perfect work anyway, because the work you're producing in school is work designed to help you learn the skills necessary to one day produce a perfect product. So if you're actually trying to produce your best work, but your best work isn't perfect, as a student, that's exactly the way it should be. However, if you are producing subpar work, and by subpar, I don't mean subpar in terms of some final goal, but some subpar in terms of what you're capable of because you're lazy or you're waiting to the last minute or whatever, you're not learning everything you can. In other words, you're not being the best student you can be either. And so this can be a problem in both of these ways. So this brings us back to that second Greek term that I mentioned, techne, which is usually translated as skill or art or artistry. It's the root word for our word technique and technical and technology. Skills, artistry, techne, these are the things that get you to perfection. If you have a particular goal in mind, a telos, a profession, a life's purpose, the whole reason you go to school is so that you can learn or acquire the skills necessary to become that thing you want to be, to reach that end, to become perfect in a particular area of professional knowledge or whatever. Once you've acquired the skills necessary, you can demonstrate that you actually know what you know, that you're actually perfect in that thing through an expert display of skill. In fact, professionally, the term expert is really a kind of synonym for the word perfect. The word professional is kind of sort of a synonym for the word perfect in the professional world. In fact, for our purposes, a better definition of perfect than the one we tend to use, than this idea of flawlessness, is probably something like an expert display of skill or an expert display of your learning. So individual people may not be perfect in a moral sense because morally you're never actually finished. You're always working on being better. Part of that is because people aren't moral or immoral. Moments, actions are moral or immoral. Morality is something you have to constantly work at. You will sometimes perform morally in a given situation, and sometimes you'll perform immorally in a given situation. But those are skills that can be developed. You can learn to be better as a moral person and eventually produce perfect moral works, perfect moral moments in your life. It's the same thing with art. Art requires skill. It requires the development of skill. And as you develop that skill, it's not that you become a perfect writer. It's that through practicing those skills, through performing those skills, you produce perfect works. Let's go to visual arts as an example of this. So here is Pablo Picasso's Guernica. Now, I don't like this painting. I think it's ugly and it's not to my taste, and I would never hang it on the wall of my home. But despite the fact that some Picasso haters have described this work as reminding them of something my nephew might draw and that my mom would hang on the refrigerator door, there is an important way in which Guernica is not at all like the doodles a child might create with crayons. That's because Guernica, for all its ugliness, is a perfect painting, whereas your nephew's Crayola doodle isn't. Now, why is this? How can this be? Because the same artist who produced Guernica also produced this. This is a piece called The Old Guitarist, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful painting, especially as compared to Picasso's Guernica, where Guernica is ugly. The Old Guitarist is lovely. But both of these paintings present an expert display of skill. Picasso didn't produce something as ugly as Guernica by accident. And he didn't produce something as ugly as Guernica because he simply couldn't produce something more beautiful. In other words, Guernica is not ugly because Picasso didn't have the skill or the artistry or the technique to produce something more beautiful. It's ugly because that was his point. He used his technique specifically, purposefully, to create something ugly. And he did that in order to capture the ugliness of war. Your nephew probably couldn't do that. Not at like 5, anyway. So both Guernica and The Old Guitarist are perfect because they are expert displays of skill. This doesn't mean that both of them are equally beautiful. This doesn't even mean that you have to like either one of them. That's because what you prefer, your preferences, the judgments you make based on personal taste, are subjective and not objective. What is beautiful or skillful or expert, these are not subjective. The old saying, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is only partially true. It's not true in the absolutist way the saying seems to suggest. What beauty is in the eye of the beholder actually means is once we have objectively determined what things belong to the category we call beautiful, which of these things you prefer is subjective. It's based on personal taste or on fashion or on your cultural influence. Our judgments regarding the beautiful, the good, like our judgments of what is green or red, these are not based solely on personal preference. These judgments appeal to something we share with other members of the human race. And when we make those judgments, we appeal to those shared values and criteria of judgment just as surely as we do when we use the term green to describe shades of the same color. We may not be able to determine exactly when green becomes yellow or blue, any more than we can absolutely determine when a heap of sand gets so small that it stops being a heap. But that doesn't mean that green isn't an objectively real thing. Just go watch some YouTube videos of a colorblind person putting on glasses that allow them to see color for the first time, or a deaf person using implants to hear for the first time, and you'll see that beauty is most certainly not in the eye of the beholder in any absolute sense. So just because we use language to describe the world around us, and just because that language, that representation of the world is constructed, this does not mean that our view of the world has been constructed arbitrarily. So the term perfect once meant not that something was flawless, but that it was finished. This means that whether it's a work of art or an apple tart, you can produce a perfect work, because once something is done, it's done. It's finished. And if that thing is done as an expert display of skill, it is perfect in every objective sense. But in order to produce something that perfect, whether it's a work of art or an apple tart or an essay, you have to first develop the expertise, the skill necessary, and then put that skill on display. This is the relationship between telos and techne, between perfection and skill. Perfection is the thing we're after, and perfection can be objective and it can be achieved, although there can clearly be a diverse variety of things that we call perfect. Learning the skills or the art that pertains to a particular kind of perfection. In the academy, we call that a discipline. That's the way we move from an immature, imperfect starting point, from student level work or producing student level work, towards maturity or perfection, expert level work. The techne gets us there, gets us to the telos, gets us to our end. And choosing to walk the path of a particular telos also implies the techne or skills you need to acquire in order to get you there. Where art is concerned, we don't talk so much about perfect artists. We talk about perfect works of art. But how does one produce a perfect work of art? Take a look at this Da Vinci. This is a painting called Lady with an Ermine. Specifically, I want you to look at the hands, how perfect they are. Anyone who's ever tried to draw knows how hard it is to get the hands right. In fact, the hands and how accurately they are portrayed, how effectively they're portrayed, is often a very good sign of a well-trained artist versus an amateur artist. So how did Da Vinci get to the point where he could draw such good hands? Look at these sketches. These are sketches that we have of Da Vinci practicing drawing hands. Practice, practice, practice. Even someone as talented, as impressive as Da Vinci first had to learn the skills acquired through training, to draw. And then he had to practice those skills over and over and over again to be able to produce such perfect work. He didn't just sit down. It didn't just come to him naturally. By the way, this is why I don't believe in the idea of an innate talent. Rather, he learned techniques, the techne for drawing good hands. And then he practiced those techniques a lot. And eventually, he was able to produce perfect works of art. Now, this doesn't mean that this painting of the Lady with the Ermine is perfect as we currently use the word perfect. If I wanted to, I could point out all kinds of flaws in the painting. Which brings us to the problem of perfectionism. There's an old saying, don't make perfect the enemy of the good. Perfectionism is the enemy of the good because it's the enemy of getting things done. Perfectionism is a wholly subjective attitude. There is nothing objective about perfectionism. Perfectionism doesn't just notice flaws, it actually creates flaws where none may exist. It interprets as flaws things that need not be defined as flaws. Perfectionism is being critical for the sake of being critical. Look again at the painting, The Lady with Ermine. I could, if I wanted to, point out all kinds of things that could be wrong with this painting. Maybe her face is wrong. Maybe I don't like the colors. Why is she sitting off to the side? All kinds of things I could point out if I wanted to. The problem with doing that is that none of the supposed imperfections I might point out are necessarily true, and none of them detract for the expertise that is clearly on display in this image. Perfectionism, then, is criticism devoid of virtue. It is criticism taken to an extreme. And it serves no real purpose, at least not any purpose that will help you improve. In fact, perfectionism's purpose is to keep you from getting finished, to keep you from your telos. It is not there to direct and drive us towards completion. It inhibits our progress towards our goals. Perfection wants you to be complete. It wants you to be done. It wants you to get finished. It wants you to achieve your telos. And it knows that in order to do that, it requires an expert display of skill. Perfectionism wants none of that. It only inhibits progress. It prevents completion. Metaphorically speaking, if perfection is God, perfectionism is the devil. Now, there are probably lots of reasons people engage in perfectionistic thinking. If you're scared of doing poorly, perfectionism allows you to avoid finishing and thus prevents you from getting a final judgment on a project. Or maybe you don't know where to go next in an essay or a piece of art or your life. And so you keep tweaking what you've already done to avoid the difficulty of forging ahead. Or maybe you're just lazy and you don't want to put in the work necessary to develop the skills or to produce, or maybe you just don't care. There are probably more reasons that people fall into perfectionistic thinking than I could ever enumerate. But the result of perfectionistic thinking is always the same: anxiety, self-defeating behaviors, and doubt that ensure you'll never get done. Once you realize this, however, once you realize that there are such things as objective and subjective approaches to things, that there are objective principles that you can work from and objective skills that you can develop that are objectively good, once you realize that perfection itself is an objective principle and that producing perfect works is only a matter of learning the right things, putting in the time and the hard work and the practice and having some patience. Once you realize all of these things, you can put away perfectionism. You can just get rid of it. You can see that a performance of skill is objectively good or bad, expert or amateur or novice, and not judge any of these things too harshly, because you'll recognize that the person performing the skill is somewhere on the path towards a telos. In fact, the only time you need to get irritated is when someone tries to deceive you and pass something off as skillful when it's not skillful, when it's an excuse for their lack of skill through some sort of sophistry, when they try to redefine something that's objectively good or bad as its opposite, or when someone is terribly judgmental of themselves because they're not able to produce something better when they don't have the skill to do so. When you decide you want to acquire a certain skill, your imperfections become okay because you know you're on a path, and that each imperfect thing that you produce is getting you better and better and better at performing that particular skill expertly. Maybe you don't want to become a great writer. That's okay. You can still become an objectively adequate writer. You can learn as much as you need to do to allow you to perform adequately, and you can then be done in terms of your own personal telos as a writer. As you go along learning the whys and wherefores of judgment, learning the objective principles of good or bad writing, for example, or good or bad art, really all this does is give you a vocabulary, a framework for organizing what you already recognize. Everyone knows that Guernica is ugly, but they also know, or should know, that Guernica is a great work of art. The question is, why can it be considered both ugly and a great work of art? Well, it's because great art doesn't have to be beautiful. Although subjectively you may prefer beauty to ugliness in your art, the category of great art is the category of those works of art that most expertly display a certain skill or skill set. Knowing this and knowing the differences between these things is what we call true judgment, what used to be called wisdom once upon a time. And wisdom is itself a kind of perfection, a telos all its own, with a set of skills that can help you get there. So perfectionism is not wisdom. And if you can recognize it for what it is, your anxiety manifesting or your laziness manifesting or some other vice trying to keep you from achieving your potential in a certain thing, trying to keep you from being done, getting finished, whatever the reasons may be, once you recognize this, you can reject your perfectionist impulses as the devilish attitude that they are. You can work through it, and you can keep yourself on the path to your particular telos, your perfection. But to do that, you have to be okay with producing poor work first. No, not okay. You have to recognize that the poor work you produce as part of the process is part of the process. It's part of the path to your telos. You have to be willing to admit that the bad is bad. You have to be willing to embrace the fact that your skills are less than they could be. And once you realize this, you can keep improving. But if you refuse to do that, you won't learn to make bad things better. You won't learn to perform better. And so you won't ultimately achieve perfect things, produce perfect things. This is true of moral perfection as well, by the way. I have no doubt that some of you have had perfect moral moments. All of us have. Moments when you did exactly the right thing in the moment. The thing that the situation called for. And you probably knew it when you did and felt good about yourself for doing the right thing. But these moments don't just happen. They were the result of instruction in virtues, the long result of years of practice, maybe the result of you responding to your moral intuitions, whatever it was. You could only do this because sometimes you got it wrong. And you learned from your mistakes. And you worked to correct your errors. This is actually in Christian parlance what we call the principle of repentance. But it's also just a basic part of the principle of maturation in anything. Being a perfect person, then, you are a work in progress. You're never finished. You won't always put on a perfect display of moral skill. But that's the same thing in art. You won't always produce perfect work. That's why we talk about the writing process. You have to practice. You have to go back, look at the words that you're using, practice using better words, learn new words. Figure out different ways to frame a sentence, to structure your paragraph, to flow through your essay and through your ideas. Whether in morality or in art, you can absolutely produce perfect works, but you can only do this if you're willing to learn the principles and practice the skills and develop the artistry necessary to do so. And this is where perfectionism gets in the way of perfection. It keeps you focused on flaws rather than on overcoming flaws. So if you're interested in becoming a better writer, a better artist, a more consistently moral person, know that perfection is attainable. It takes time and effort, but it's attainable. And know that perfectionism, the demonization of your imperfections, or the demonization of your immaturities, the demonization of your artlessness, the artlessness that's a natural part of the process of maturation, perfectionism is not your friend. And it is not leading you towards perfection. It is not leading you towards a better product. It's a deception. It's a lie. It wants to keep you from getting done. Don't listen to it. Don't listen to the devil of perfectionism. You listen to Jesus. You be perfect. Get yourself a telos. Learn and practice the skills for that perfection by acquiring the artistry necessary to perform admirably in whatever art it is, whatever discipline it is, whatever profession it is. You develop the techne or learn the techne to achieve your telos, and you can make it happen. So remember, art is not magic. Writing is not magic. It's skill. That's all I have for today.